Welcome to the Western Baul podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of this series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only, and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled Divine Alchemy, What is it? The talk was given by Mary Angelon Young on January 18th, 2025 via Zoom. Angelon is a workshop leader with a background in Jungian psychology, an editor and author of As It Is, Under the Punnai Tree, The Baul Tradition, Caught in the Beloved's Petticoats, Enlightened Duality with Lee Lozowick, The Art of Contemplation, and other books. In this talk, she speaks about the 12 stages of the Western tradition of alchemy and about CG Jung's 4 stages, which we experience in our lives. Angelon notes that alchemy is about transformation and that something has to be dissolved before it can be reborn in a new form. She says that there is no settled final state to attain, and also that what we are working for is already present, but that we have to work to discover it. Angelon references some of her experiences with her teacher, Lee Lozowick, during the talk. Early in the presentation, she discusses archetypal figures from a tarot deck, which were screen shared. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Angelon Young.
Thank you, everyone who's here on the Zoom gathering tonight. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, welcome to you also. Very happy to be here with you tonight. This is an ancient and deep and personal and impersonal subject. This Latin phrase, magnum opus, it means great work. Of course, some of us may be familiar with the term the work because the Russian mystic and spiritual teacher, G.I. Gurdjieff, he used this term. He got it from the alchemists. Of course, it's been around for thousands of years. The great work. So it's a sacred work. It's an inner work. It's an inner yoga. You might hear it referred to in that kind of way if we come in from the Hindu tradition. But it's been around really forever, probably since the dawn of human consciousness on this planet, as our very oldest, most remote ancestors were watching the night sky and paying attention to the seasons and the cycles of nature. They were beginning to tune into these rhythms and patterns and cycles. And of course, they had access to superpowers that we don't have access to today, like intuitive relationship with nature, with plants, with water, with the 5 elements, earth, air, fire, water, and space. And so they were able to, like the rishis of ancient India, to just extract information or receive, actually, more than extract, but to open and be vulnerable to and to receive wisdom and information and knowledge directly from nature in so many different kinds of ways. And so this system of alchemy evolved. Of course, there's Eastern alchemy, which is kind of encapsulated in the Taoist tradition. I don't know if any of you have ever read The Golden Flower, which is a Taoist text. CG Jung, who I'll be talking about a lot tonight, wrote an introduction and a commentary for that book many decades ago. So there's this Eastern version and flavor of alchemy, and then there's the Western esoteric tradition of alchemy. We find alchemy everywhere in shamanism, in poetry, in the tarot, which I'm going to go to in just a minute here. But the Western tradition of alchemy is inextricably linked with myth and with ancient traditions that came out of Egypt, for example, or ancient Greece. And this great work became the work of awakening consciousness, the primary metaphor being transforming lead into gold. So as I go through a lot of this alchemical language tonight, please dial your listening to symbolic language, because it is all in symbolic language, not only lead to gold, but you'll hear lots of different kinds of alchemical language. And in the Eastern tradition, this symbolic language is called twilight language or Sandhya Bhasha. So alchemy has connections with dream, with myth, with poetry, with the deep, deep intuitive life of any embodied creature. And so I invite you to listen with the ears, with the listening of, we're speaking in symbols, and see where that takes you. You know, I had my first brushes with alchemy. I don't know if I'd even heard the word before, probably somewhere when I was 19 and someone gave me my first tarot deck. And so this was my first encounter. Maybe about 5 or 6 years later, someone gave me the Book of Thoth in San Francisco, and I had the good fortune of being mentored a little by a very fine tarot reader. And over about a 10-year stretch of really immersing myself in the tarot, I began to understand that it was not about me figuring out what decision to make, that the tarot wasn't going to answer my questions. What it was going to do was it was going to lead me on a journey deeper into myself. Because the tarot, and specifically the major arcana of the tarot, is an alchemical journey. It's really a contemplative tool, even though, of course, yes, it can be used for divination. And yes, we can ask it questions. And it's a fantastic tool of synchronicity and of twilight language, of symbolic language. So would you put that screen share up so we can just look at it for a moment while I'm talking? So many of you are familiar with the tarot. The tarot is made up of 2 different parts: the minor arcana, which are basically like 4 suits representing the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And they have more to do with the day-to-day nitty-gritty of what we're going through and the cycles and patterns of life in relationship to our thoughts, our feelings, our vision and creative energies, and how we are with the earth energy. But this, what you're looking at right now, this is called the major arcana. And this is the archetypal, the most powerful part of the tarot, which is very, very connected with the Kabbalah. And as you can see, it starts with the Fool, and then it goes on to the Magician, the High Priestess, the Empress, the Emperor, the Hierophant. And those are just the first 6. Each one of these cards are doorways of contemplation. They're doorways into deep, deep inquiry and questioning about ourselves, about how we are interacting with every aspect of our lives. And then it goes on: the Lovers, the Chariot, Strength, the Hermit. That's our card for this year, 2025, the Hermit. The Wheel of Fortune, Change. Then Justice, the Hanged Person. And then we get into Death, Temperance, the Devil, the Tower. And then it changes again: the Star, the Moon, the Sun, Judgment, and the World. So here's an alchemical journey. I'm just starting with this because we're going to take a little light brush over what alchemy is here tonight in our time together. Thanks, that's good. But this is where it really started for me. And this was so helpful to me because, of course, as a young person, I knew that I was on a spiritual path and things were happening. Life was happening. And so how could I make sense of and maybe even make use of the ups and the downs, the ongoing death and rebirth that was happening in my life and the kinds of experience I was having with, say, my dream life and things like that? I could say a lot more about how connected all of this is to ancient astronomy, astrology, all of these ancient arts that humanity was developing over literally thousands of years, along with their understanding of alchemy and the basic processes of nature and how things evolve and change and transform. Because alchemy is all about transformation. If we're going to change lead into gold, already we've got some idea about a very common substance. We automatically might have some associations with lead. It's dense, it's thick. It can poison you, to gold, which is brilliant and radiant and precious substance. So this great work is about transformation, and it's about working with the prima materia, the original, the primordial material that we are given in incarnation, which is our consciousness. But of course, we don't separate consciousness from the body. So it's also the body. The body is going through this transformation also. So in my 30s, I'm making a very long story really short here, of course. In my 30s, I really discovered CG Jung and his work. Jung was just an incredible, and is still an incredible source of illumination and wisdom and teaching. His benefit to the world, it hasn't even been scratched yet. I'm quite sure that it will ongoingly unfold. But the last several decades of his life, he immersed himself in the study of alchemy. And of course, he wrote a couple of really very big books that I have over here on this bookshelf. Psychology and Alchemy is the first one. And the second one is Mysterium Conjunctionis, which means the sacred marriage, the mysterious union of the opposites. So out of that, out of all of the work that he did, and he amassed a tremendous library of ancient, really arcane alchemical writings. His personal library contained manuscripts that were hundreds of years old that he had gathered from all over Europe. And he just immersed himself in this, and he started tracing these connections. He started mapping the relationship between what he was understanding in the twilight language, the symbolic language of the alchemists, and what he was experiencing within himself and with his clients, his analysans, his patients, the alchemy of their psychological transformations that they were going through. And of course, we've probably heard some of his most popular and well-known short quotes saying things like, "You do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And here's another really good one. "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." So, of course, the unconscious is the infinity upon infinity of the unknown, of the divine. There's no way we can make all of that conscious. It's not even possible. But we have given to us this human possibility to begin to make our portion of it what is possible for us in this realm, in this incarnation, to begin to make more and more of that conscious. So I'm going to end up back with Jung again, but I want to go to some of the classical alchemy. There are people around today who consider themselves very serious alchemists. You can find them, of course, on the internet and in libraries also. Some of those contemporary alchemists say that there are 12 stages of alchemy. And that's fine. And I think that's extremely useful. And I have a whole bunch of material on those stages. So tonight, I'm going to just take a really short journey through those 12 stages. And then we'll kind of synthesize it down to CG Jung's 4 stages, which is very, very helpful because it gets confusing when you've got 12 stages and each one of them is in Latin. The title of it is in Latin. Okay, 12 stages of alchemy as the ancient alchemists understood it, at least in contemporary language. The first stage is calcination, calcinatio in Latin. And this is the stage when we begin to realize that we are, in fact, calcified, hardened. There's a humbling that is going to be happening for us because we are going to go through some purification by fire in this stage. It's the beginning of the whole thing. We began a very deep self-evaluation. We realize that we're suffering. We realize that we're crystallized, that we're covered with all kinds of layers of protective covering. Maybe things are really going wrong in our lives. There's a lot of breakdown possibly happening, but we're forced into a contemplation. And this is a beginning of a number of experiences where we have to begin to intuit the darkness within us. both the positive, loving, warm womb of darkness and that darkness that is about what we have repressed and denied, or that which is unhealed, that which is wounded in us, that which is buried under layers and layers and layers of trauma. So we go through this experience of purification by fire, in which we're starting to get broken down. And the second stage is called dissolutio, dissolution. Now we're going to go through some further breakdown, but this time it's going to be immersion in the unconscious, beginning with a little bit of surrender, a little tiny bit of surrender will happen. It's purification by water. More and more of our buried traumas, more and more of our samskaras, our karmas, have ripened to the point that they're starting to bubble up to the surface. They're coming up to the surface because they're going to be dissolved more and more and more. The third stage, separation, separatio. We begin to get a little inkling of rediscovering something deeper in ourselves. We're doing a lot of shadow work here at this point. Shame, trauma, disappointment. So we're going deeper and deeper into the underworld. We're going deeper and deeper into the shadow. And a lot of this third stage, it's often referred to as the dark night of the soul, because all of the things that we thought were going to hold us up, that were going to carry us through, have now fallen apart. They've been dissolved. Because, of course, the prime maxim of alchemy is solve et coagula. You have to dissolve the thing before it can be reformed, before it can be reborn in a new form. So now we're really deep into that. We move through that and we go to 4, the conjunctio, the conjunction of the opposites. So now we've gotten far enough down into ourselves, we're beginning to recognize that there are all of these pairs of opposites within us. There's masculine and feminine in us. There's darkness and light in us. There's death and birth in us. There's logos and eros in us. Whatever all twilight language we want to use, or different ways of talking about the pairs of opposites. That's all within us. And we have a moment of the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage within us. Something gets unified. There's an integration that happens in us. And out of that, we have an experience, maybe a little taste of heaven on earth. We might even experience synchronicities happening. We'll probably start noticing things like that in our lives. This is just number 4. We've still got a long way to go. We've had a little experience of heaven on earth. Good, we can keep going, right? We can do this. So I want to add something in before we go further, which is that, of course, this is not necessarily a strictly linear process. We'll be intuiting that as we go further through 12 stages. And it's not a one-time deal, because the process of alchemy transformation keeps happening. We may have even worked on one aspect of ourselves. We've gone through a whole bunch of transformation in one part of ourselves, but there are other parts that also later will come forward, or we're working at a deeper level now. As my teacher Lee used to say, there's no top end. This just keeps going. It's the natural process of creation. So going on to number 5. So we just experienced a little heaven on earth. It was really good. We had some insights. Okay, great. Number 5, putrefactio, putrefaction. And there's a particular aspect of this called mortificatio, mortification. They say this is when black becomes blacker than black. Here we do deeper shadow work than we have imagined, and probably we are going to be doing even collective shadow work. Because those of us who have worked intensely on the spiritual path know that we're connected to the all and to the whole. We're connected to the whole of our species. We're connected to the whole of our planet, our solar system, our galaxy, the universe, creation. This is a particular time. We may have very deep feelings of loss, failure. We may be grieving. So things have to putrefy again. We have to go through that process, some more of that process. When things putrefy, of course, they're also dissolving. That was number 5. Number 6 is coagulation, coagulatio. So things get dissolved and then they get firmed up again. And every time we go through that dissolution, we come back and we go through some kind of a feeling of a rebirth. Now we're ready to start again. Somehow the forces have been marshaled. We've gathered the life force. We've cleared something out. We're ready to keep going. And well, of course, we need a container. We need architecture inside ourselves for that. And that's part of the coagulation. That's our spiritual practice, our help that we receive. Our families, our Sangha, our close friends that are helping us on the path, and we're helping them, of course, too. It's very mutual. So things coagulate again, and a new confidence arises from beyond. It's rather inexplicable. We don't know where these things come from. How is it that everything falls apart and then it comes back together? We return again to the garden of light. There's a sense of the emergence of the deep self. We have a little taste of that again. It's beautiful. Some systems call this the birth of the philosopher's stone. It begins here at this level. We're creating a body of light. So we still have a long ways to go. 7, cibation, cibatio, I suppose. After everything we've been through, now there's a change of paradigm. There's a change of lifestyle. There are things we have to let go of to move on to the next levels. Something in the form of our lives has to change. We're tossing away old patterns. We're learning what kinds of food we need on all levels. What's going to support us going forward into this new worldview. The Greeks have this beautiful word, metanoia. I love this word. It's a change of worldview. Literally, how we see things changes. So how are we going to support that going forward? Well, there will be change in the form. In some way, maybe small, maybe subtle. Number 8, sublimatio, sublimation. So here we have further purification because that which has been coagulated now has to be made sublime. And it's becoming more and more subtle. Number 9, fermentation, fermentatio. This is a time of gestation, fermentation. We could use the image of being pregnant. Something has to grow within us. All kinds of processes, secret processes have to happen within us. And those things happen in the depths. Now we're operating in the unknown. This wonderful Baul writer, Sri Anirvan, he says in one of his books, movements of a yogic nature are happening all the time within us. We don't have to be conscious of those. We don't need to have a strictly rational, logical relationship to what's going on. It's very mysterious. And so that's true. When things are being sublimated, they're being made sublime and they're fermenting. It's possible. It looks like nothing is happening because so much is happening in the depths. There's so much integration that's going on. So number 10, exaltatio, exaltation. We experience a time of ecstasy, a time of exaltation. Insight, awareness. We are aware that our awareness is more awake. We have access to incredible inspiration, creativity. Magic is happening. I like that one a lot. Of course, this isn't something that we can force to happen. It's all about having an intention for this alchemy, an intention for alchemy. Okay, number 11. Multiplicatio, multiplication. There's an increase of potency. There's an increase of gain. There's an exponential transformation. Things are moving fast. We're really in the domain of magic and mystery. And then 12, projection, the power to create. the great maxim from the master alchemist, the Egyptian master Hermes Trismegistus Hermes, the Hermetic maxim, as above, so below, as within, so without, as in the soul, so in the universe. The thing about projection here and being able to create, having the power to create, is that at this level, we are aligned with the divine will. This isn't about, I will now create. I has been through all this whole process of being broken down. This is about the magician. Those of you who know the tarot, we were just looking at that. The second card is the magician. There's 0, the fool, and then there's 1, the magician. And the magician has one hand up to heaven and the other hand down to earth. So it's about, at this point, being aligned to divine will. Thy will be done, and let me be the servant of that. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any comments or questions from you all. I'm certain that you've been through lots of rounds of this.
I'm interested to know how much of this process you have gone through, how much of it you're speaking from experience, and how has that been for you?
Well, I'm 74. I've been through a lot of this, and I think I'm going through a whole lot more of it. And for me, life has been many, many cycles of death and rebirth. So it's very personal for me. My teacher, Lee, he was very fond of alchemy. 2 of his published books titled The Alchemy of Transformation and The Alchemy of Love and Sex. And he liked this phrase, divine alchemy. And he would bring the shaman's view to it, the shamanic view to it. But he would say, my students think that I'm doing all of this alchemy. I'm putting them through all of this death and birth and all this business. And he said, but actually, I don't do anything. Life does it all. So, I mean, I could sit here and talk about some of the many cycles of my own life, parenting cycles, relationship cycles, marriages, divorces, cycles of traveling, cycles of loss, cycles of tremendous grief, of losing people that I loved and being plunged into blacker than black. Grief is the most profound alchemy. And I've been through a lot of grief in my life. That's the human reality. This is a quote from the Rosarium Philosophorum. This is an ancient alchemical text. And it says, when you see your matter, matter, going black, rejoice. You are at the beginning of the work. So for me, one of the things that I can talk about is this tremendous amount of inner work, working with the shadow, working with my own self, this prima materia of this human being, with all of my gifts and limitations. That's the prima materia. So yes, it's very personal for me. Maybe some more things will come up.
I was struck by, I don't remember the number of the stage, but you called it the Philosopher's Stone stage.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that was a stage that you created the body of light. And I was wondering, was it creating the body of light or is discovering or finding it? I was curious about that.
They say that the prima materia, the consciousness, that's what we use. That's what we have at the beginning, and it's what we have at the end. So there's, of course, a big paradox in there. The thing that we're working for is already there. Mm-hmm. But then if we look at it through another facet, and the way that the alchemists were looking at it is that we actually have to engage this work in order to discover what's already there. In Vajrayana Buddhism, the rainbow body, or certain different traditions have the diamond body. There are many references to this. And my understanding is it's a paradox. Somehow I do have to do that work. I had a dream not too long ago, 4 or 5 months ago, and I don't remember the entire dream, but the takeaway for me with that dream was that I was with some friends that I've been on the path with for a long time. We were busy working, as we often are in my dreams. And I remember saying to a friend of mine, we're coating our bodies with gold. And it wasn't like our bodies, yours and mine, and yours and yours. Yes, it was plural. All of us were doing this, but it was also my bodies, my subtle bodies are being coated with gold. That's the alchemical process showing itself because it does so much in dreams. It will absolutely speak to you.
Can you say anything about what the heart experiences as you go through the stages?
Well, the heart's involved in all of it.
But what does it feel like from a feeling center point of view?
Well, it feels like many different things. It feels like really scary. It feels really sad sometimes. It feels really joyous at times. It feels, and it feels. And without feeling, none of this happens. None of it can happen without the feeling heart.
The words are useful, and I'm looking for a more deeper connection than I get through the words to relate to what you're saying. And in my head, I do, but I feel like that's not it.
Well, for me, the whole thing is a feeling process, the whole experience of it. It's a very important question that you're raising and a very interesting question. So, how do I make this real for me in my life? How can I use this map in my life? Everybody's been through times when we felt like we were losing it all, or when everything fell apart, or we had to face something about ourselves. It was a bitter pill to swallow, or we're shocked that we suddenly see something in ourselves. We let ourselves for just a moment, our persona slips and we get to see our own shadow for a second. You know, there was this movie that was really popular about 35 years ago called Angel Heart. Mickey Rourke plays this detective in New Orleans. It's a murder mystery, and he's hunting for the person who committed this terrible crime. And you go through the whole movie, and he's following clue after clue after clue and getting these insights, and he'll go here and he's hot on the tail of the murderer. And at the very end, he realizes that it was him. And this is one of the most fantastic demonstrations in art of this confrontation with the shadow. This is a big purification process, and it doesn't just happen one time. It's really easy to feel like we know ourselves and we still are missing huge pieces. If we could see that, so much would be liberated in us. So much of our possibility of service and love and of creativity would be liberated if we could just see clearly.
See what we're missing, or see that we are missing seeing it?
Well, both. See what we're not seeing about what motivates us to do things, seeing how we hurt others and we don't even know we're doing it, seeing how we try to manipulate situations, shadow work. So there's that level of work. And then there's the work of we lose a good friendship. Someone just says, I don't want to relate with you anymore. Or maybe we say that to them. I mean, all kinds of things happen in a long life. Or we just naturally outgrow someone. We do outgrow. We go through these cycles of becoming. We're not the same person now. I am not the same person now that I was when I was in my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, my 50s. Right? Well, something's been going on that's been changing you. You've been growing, but there's always more. So, yes, sometimes it's very scary in deep spiritual work when we're working with emptiness. Anytime we're working with emptiness, the unknown, this is very scary for ego. It's very scary for the persona. It's very scary for more superficial aspects of our being. So, yeah, it's scary to confront emptiness until we become more familiar with it, because it's a great mystery. We'll never let the mystery be the mystery. Let it keep being the mystery, because it's going to be anyway. Okay. If you pick up one of Jung's big, thick books on alchemy, of course, there's going to be all those stages and all kinds of ancient alchemical drawings and a lot of things that are very difficult to decipher and make a lot of sense of. But Jung and those people who have spent their lives delving into his work and integrating it into their own experience and commenting on it and shedding light on it have boiled it down to 4 different stages of alchemy. And of course, it begins with the Nigredo. The first one, Nigredo, is either Latin or Spanish or something. Nigredo, Nigredo. And this is the color black. So here we are, once again, we're in this time of darkness, of a really deep dive into ourselves. Jung has had a lot to say about this being the time of loss and grief, whether it's a loss of someone that we loved who died and we're plunged into grief, or it's a loss of something in ourselves. St. Augustine says, disappointment is the beginning of the spiritual path. And I love this quote because I have definitely experienced really profound disappointments on the spiritual path. And I would dare to say that if we haven't experienced some disappointment on the spiritual path, well, at least certainly we can say we need to look deeper at what we're doing. Disillusionment on the spiritual path. We want to be disillusioned because that's us being relieved of our illusions, right? The teacher is a human being, for example. Or some closely and deeply held belief does not sustain us. I had a friend, I haven't seen him in a very, very long time, but he's a really renowned artist and practitioner and had practiced with many great teachers and Rinpoches. And one of his daughters died unexpectedly, and he was plunged into such an incredible grief and loss. And I asked him, I said, has your practice seen you through this? This was a long time ago when I asked him this. And he looked at me and he said, no. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the practice. It means that we need to have that experience of having no ground beneath our feet, the blacker than black. This is an alchemical initiation. It's a great mystery. So can we trust? Can we surrender? Because there's a lot of surrender that's required in this Nigredo, in the first big purification. One of the contemporary writers that I really like, that I discovered, he calls this stage the confession. And he says the process of confession begins alchemically with the concept of the Nigredo, also the blackening, which is a psycho-symbolic death. This is the stage of revelation and catharsis. It's where we burn away our psychological dross. It's where the shadow gets integrated and then mined for hidden gold. As Carl Jung said, no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. Our shadow reaches all the way into hell. We climb into hell to integrate it. We climb into hell to animate our inner monster and bring it into sacred alignment with the whole self. This is no easy task. It's a dark time. Despair and disillusionment are all consuming. The ego is murdered by the primal life force. The blackening is a cocooning that cooks the corpse of the ego inside it. Annihilation becomes integration. It is a marriage of chaos and order, the coalescence of shadow and light, the union of summit and abyss. This gives way to the second phase. So you can be sure we're going to be feeling a lot when we're going through this. Shock, horror, anger, sadness, profound sorrow, fear. Yes, we're going to feel a lot, of course. We're reaching down into the depths of ourselves to find what is actually there, because there is something there, of course. if nothing can be called something, which of course it can. So this gives way to the second phase. Only 4 phases this time. Good. This one is called the albedo, the illumination. And the color of this is white. It's also known as the whitening. The process of illumination begins alchemically with the concept of the albedo, also called the whitening. This is the stage of awakening and insight. It's where our new shadow perspective helps us deflate the ego and where unneeded, illusory, or false concepts are shed. It's where the inner opposites, the anima animus, the masculine and feminine, the eros and logos, gets integrated and cultivated. The ashes left over from the blackening are purified. The black crow is transformed into a white raven. The heavy-hearted coal is pressurized into the light-hearted diamond. The end of the lesser work is at hand, and the beginning of the higher work becomes manifest. This integration of the masculine and feminine, which is key, the inner marriage of this stage, is not an easy task. There's a lot of work involved. It could take years. We're going through alchemical cycles that are very short ones that might last a day or a week or a month. And then we go through cycles that would last maybe a lifetime, or cycles that would last a decade or 5 years or an unknown period of time. Cycles within cycles. It's sort of a paradox, another paradox. We're very simple in many ways, but we're also very, very complex. So it's no simple task, this second stage, but it is profoundly rewarding. We discover that there's a light side to every dark side, that there's masculine within the feminine and feminine within the masculine, just like the Tao, the yin and the yang. There's softness buried within the roughest patch of our lives. There's gold in the shadow. People who study Jung's work and do this kind of transpersonal work, this specific path of transpersonal work, are very fond of saying there's gold in the shadow. Because the shadow isn't only like our hidden motivations and the things that we do that cause suffering to ourselves and others. It's also the innate beauty and giftedness of our beings that we're not allowing to come forward because of wounds, because of traumas, because of samskaras and karmas. We put it in traditional spiritual terms. We're not letting that come through because we are human beings with limitations. We're not even able to let it come through necessarily, but there are things that we can do. We can bring our conscious awareness to ourselves and our own process in a way that begins to free up the knots that don't allow the free flow of that graceful energy through us that's wanting to come through. There's even good luck hidden inside bad luck. There was a Zen teacher, Son Sanim, who had this saying that my teacher Lee was fond of, which is bad situation, good situation. Good situation, bad situation. Meaning if your life is so easy, you're never provoked into the kind of growth that hardship brings us to. Hardship, obstacles, blocks, tough breaks, this crafts our being, our personality, our capacity to be human, all of that. A man who honors his inner feminine and a woman who honors her inner masculine is truly a force to be reckoned with, what Nietzsche referred to as the primordial unity. For they are that much closer to achieving their cosmic inheritance. They have become a force of integrated nature first and an individual human second. You really like that. A force of integrated nature first and an individual human second. This leads to the sacred dawn of consciousness, and we're now in 3, which is citrinitas. It's the color yellow, and this particular writer calls this education, and I like this a lot because we do a lot of learning and growing in this life. Literally, life is educating us. We're in the school of life. So I have a fondness for educating, being educated, sharing education. The process of education begins alchemically with the concept of the citrinitas, also called the yellowing. This is the stage of absorption and wisdom. It's where our integrated shadow and masculine feminine wakes up to the solar dawn of the emerging soul. It's where the inner student meets the inner master, where courage meets wisdom, where the animal shakes hands with the sage. It's where the wise old man or wise old woman archetype gets integrated into the whole. He quotes Aristotle as saying, "What more accurate stand or measure of good things do we have than the sage?" The sage leads us into the greater possibility of the magnum opus, the greater work, which is, of course, we're no longer working for ourselves. We're working for life, for creation, and for all beings. We are now freed up enough, and we have enough access to the fact of our own innate being, our own sahaja, our own natural self. We have access to that so that we can serve all of life. The dawn of the soul is like the rising sun, golden, radiant, and enlightening, illuminating. It gives color and shape to the once colorless black and white world. It's the love child of shadow and the mystical marriage, the rising sun of ego's death. So I might not put it quite like that, but I thought it was nice. So I also like this, as Aristotle is saying, what more accurate stand or measure of good things do we have than the sage? Because this time of education, at least in my life, meeting my teacher when I was 36 and going through some very intense decades with him, and all that he taught me, he's not a sage now in that he's not in the body anymore, but what he has given me is of such a great value, connecting me to something in me that does know, even though I may not have access to it a lot of the time. I may be in parts of the cycle where it's black and I don't know what's happening next. And it's quite often, if I'm in that part of some cycle that I'm going through in my ongoing human experience of being on a transformational path, that sure enough, Lee will show up in my dreams often. It's not always Lee. It's Lee as me. It's me, not me, like Mary Angelon Young. It's the deep self. It's the dream maker. Because, the thing about the sage or the Rinpoche or the teacher, the guru, the Roshi, the mentor, whoever that is, the rabbi, that person is turning us to ourselves. As Shiva always says to Parvati in her many different forms in the great myths in the Shiva Tantra, she asks him a question, "Oh, great Mahadev, how can we cross the ocean of samsara, the ocean of all the many illusions that we have?" And he always starts out like this. He says, "Oh, Parvati, because you are my very self, I will answer you." So the sage is always turning us to the sage within. It may not look that way in moments, but that is always the way it is. Okay, so number 4, this one's the rubedo, the reddening. And this writer that I've been sharing with us tonight calls this transformation. The Turba Philosophorum, another alchemical text, says, "Know, all you seekers after this art, that unless you whiten, you cannot make red, because the two natures are nothing other than red and white. Whiten, therefore, the red, and redden the white." There's some twilight language for us. It's not a linear process, but here we go. The process of transformation begins with the concept of the rubedo, also called the reddening. This is the final stage of transpersonal self-overcoming. It's where the alchemy of psychology becomes a fountainhead. It's where the unity of opposites, shadow and light, masculine and feminine, anima and animus, beast and sage, becomes transcendent, provident, and mercurial. It's where the self archetype becomes the process of integration itself. The reddening is a bleeding into blackening, because we're going to go back to black, of course. It's the life-death rebirth process lived through in real time, in each moment, with each new breath. It's both a rising out of falling and a falling into rising. Both a chaos creating order and an order creating chaos. There is no self-actualization without self-transformation. The self-archetype is ever in the throes of overcoming itself. In the end, there is no end. There is no remaining. There's no settled state. There's no final stage. The magnum opus eats itself or it doesn't sing. The philosopher's stone is always just ahead of the curve on the transformation continuum. The journey is always the thing, or it is nothing. The sword is always sharpened dullness. The diamond of the self is always pressurized coal. As James Hillman said, the pearl is also always grit, an irritation as well as a luster. So, are there any comments at this point?
The Ouroboros is related to everything you just said. You want to speak about that symbol?
Well, yes. And actually, thank you for saying that. I would have forgotten the Ouroboros. It's a serpent swallowing its own tail or a dragon swallowing its own tail. And that is the alchemical symbol for that beautiful description that he just gave us. It's a very ancient symbol. I love the Zen simplicity. Suzuki Roshi saying, beginner's mind. We always start as beginners. At the next level, we're a total beginner again. I think what's really valuable about it is that there's this aspect in alchemy and the psychological understanding of it that somehow we have to go back to a former state before we make the next leap. It's that thing of like we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I love this image of the wave, of how waves work, whether it's a cosmic wave or an ocean wave. The waves keep coming and the wave peaks and crests, and then it falls back in on itself and it sort of pools there and it goes down into a dip, a little hollow, and there it gathers force. And then it kind of sucks back and then it surges again. And that's this alchemical process. And my understanding is that that image also speaks to that.
Mm-hmm.
Have you felt this? I thought I'd already learned this. Why am I doing this again? We're going to go a little bit further with it this time. So I appreciate that a lot, that we go back to a former state before something can coagulate in a new form. And this thing of starting with blackness and going back to it again and again and again is that we are continually encountering the suffering of ourselves and others. And maybe sometimes we're so overwhelmed by the suffering of others that we have to go through this whole process. We're actually doing it for the world. Of course, we're benefiting. Of course, there's always benefit. All beings are benefited. Maybe we have to go through it. It's not even about me this time.
You mentioned earlier that there's an Eastern version of alchemy, and everything you've talked about up to now has been the Western version. Do you want to talk about the Eastern model?
No, I don't. I want to mention it out of respect and honor, but I don't feel qualified to speak to the Taoist tradition of alchemy. I have studied the Western a little bit, so.
Okay.
One of the many things that I love about this tradition is that I have found it everywhere, of course, in nature, in great nature, in the tarot, as I mentioned, in the science and art of astrology, in my own path.
having gone through some cycles of this, as we all do, it'd be really hard for me to consider that this just repeats itself. I mean, assumedly in a different way, but reality is hard and it's persistent and it knocks you on your ass every time, as Werner Erhard said. But something that's heartening to me is that I really feel like it brings us to love. That's an important element to me, because just going through these cycles over and over again to purify myself of my ignorance about reality just seems painful. It's a lot of suffering. And I found that after having gone through some periods of having real primal feelings after a loss and learning from the ground up in a non-conceptual way, having to feel my way through that, I feel like more myself, stronger, and also more capable of experiencing love for life. So to me, that's important, that this process is ongoing, but also there are great inner rewards.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, that's the whole point of it, actually. When we use words like we're more liberated or we're more able to serve or there's a time of ecstasy or rapture, all of those things happen within the field of love.
I don't think I could continue if that wasn't the case.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that we would not be able to continue if we didn't see the process through, say, a time of deep inner alchemy where we experience this being broken down inside. If we didn't see it all the way through and like trust the process and go with it to have the experience of the opening that will happen. And when it opens, there's an influx. I don't remember which stage it was, one of them where the experience is one of ecstasy. It's an intermarriage. It's a union. Love is abounding everywhere. Yeah. So if we didn't have those tastes, we certainly wouldn't be willing to keep doing it. And it's those moments of clarity or glimpses of truth or glimpses of what reality actually is, or tastes, little sips of divine love. We wouldn't stay on the path, probably. What I love about finding alchemy amongst the poets, when they are referring to these dark nights, they're able to give an intimation of the mystery of the process and to give us a little taste of the magic and wonder of it. For me, love is the field that all of that's happening in. There is no magic, and there is no wonder, and there is no freedom, and there is no insight, or I'm not terribly fond of the word enlightenment these days. Maybe I got that from my teacher too, but I actually have come to it on my own, although it's a good word. I'm much more interested in surrender, I think, at this point, surrendering to the great mystery of it all. So I love going to music and art and poetry because these things can sustain us through periods of darkness. And yes, it's another talk altogether. It's a whole other night of like, well, what do you do if you're in the Negredo and it's blacker than black? How can you manage that? So I go to the poets a lot, and I go to music and art and beauty a lot. And I find that to be the food that I need. Since I've been educating myself that I need different kinds of food. So much of the alchemical process is about letting go. And there are so many ways to talk about that and to find doorways into that and to be surrendered to the inexorable realities of life that bring us to the necessity to let go, that's just the sheer intense necessity to let go. This is from Mary Oliver. I'm going to end with a poem. Sometimes the great bones of my life feel so heavy, and all the tricks my body knows, the opposable thumbs, the kneecaps, and the mind clicking and clicking don't seem enough to carry me through this world. And I think how I would like to have wings, blue ones, ribbons of flame, to live in this world. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends upon it, and when the time comes, to let it go. I love poetry because it helps to tend the spiritual imagination, and alchemy does that in its own way. It just gives us maybe a few little hints here or there of like what some of the inner process that we're going through might be about.